Hey, welcome to your weekly Corner Späti. It is myself, Nick, and I'm joined today with special guest Matt Broomfield, who is a freelance journalist dealing primarily with Kurdish activism, Kurdish groups, and also in a general aspect, I guess, the left in Turkey, but more specifically within Kurdish groups, Kurdistan. Matt, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And so for those who have been more or less completely living under a rock, this is, I guess I'm going to say this is like part two of us covering the Turkish elections, even though this part is maybe not so directly connected to the elections. But I wanted to have you on specifically because of your work and there's an article that you recently wrote for Jacobin, just kind of outlining the sense of the Turkish elections. But we're here with Matt today to talk about the situation of the Turkish left, which we've talked about in the past about Kurdistan and such with guests like Kerem. I'll link that below if you want to listen back to that episode from a few years ago. But I thought it'd be maybe like arbitrarily just start with Gezi and what the trajectory then of the Turkish left has kind of been from from someone like myself outside looking in. If we take Gezi and kind of move to then we are now, what has then been the, in your briefest summary, if you will, of this almost kind of decade of this massive turning point in the Turkish left, and also, I mean, and the reaction then too from the the Erdogan government.
Yeah, of course. Well, yeah, I mean, I think Gezi Park. So when we say Gezi, we're talking about these Gezi Park protests that people listening will probably remember in a similar breath to a similar kind of spirit and time. A little bit later to some of the Occupy movements in the West, and it was marked by some of the same characteristics of those protests, sort of in terms of the style and method of protest, but also was very different because this is Turkey we're talking about, and Turkey is kind of located quite differently. So I think for me in general, kind of the interesting thing about the situation in Turkey, or one of the interesting things, is that has this pivotal role in several senses, geographically, geostrategically, politically, also in the sense that it's not an authoritarian regime. It's not a total dictatorship, but it very much looks like one. But also there is room for dissent, and there is room also, as we'll talk about today, for some kind of action in the parliament. But then nor can you say that it's a parliamentary democracy in any meaningful sense. So Gezi Park protests, just in case people aren't aware, sort of started as a protest over land rights and the usage of this place, Gezi Park. And this space was occupied because the Turkish government wanted to turn it to privatise it and concrete it over, essentially. But I think, what kind of more probably concerns us, if we're looking at the period post-Gezi, is, as these things do, the movement grew. Some external groups got involved with it to different degrees. That movement then kind of fizzled and died. But then there came, an authoritarian response from the Turkish government. So there's maybe just 2 points I would mention now about what happened post-Gezi. One is about the relationship between the Turkish left in general and the Kurdish movement, and one is about the Turkish government kind of crackdown in response to that. So Gezi came at this kind of complicated moment where a lot of people were angry and taking to the streets. We're not kind of really feeling represented by mainstream politics in Turkey. Partly because of that, then it also came at a time of kind of rising interest in and support for the Kurdish movement, which represents the only kind of major mass organized, serious leftist progressive force in Turkey today, and has done for some time. And so then there were questions coming out of Gezi around, for ordinary people in Turkey, maybe because they were wary of the Kurds because they heard they're all terrorists, they've been told by the government, maybe because they were coming from a more anarchist background, for example, in some cases, and the Kurds also have their political parties, legal and illegal parties, and people were concerned about working with them. And then also the Kurdish movement was unsure about how much it should take steps to directly support and be seen to be supporting this movement. So there was a kind of questions in the air about, do we work with the Kurdish-led opposition bloc, either in the parliament or more generally? Do we support them? So these ideas were kind of going around at the time of Gezi, as you can imagine, in the camp, in the discussions, and in the media afterwards. And then so that's kind of one side of what was in the air as people that kind of left Gezi Park and moved on and looked for new avenues to continue their political organising. But then sort of Gezi Park sort of, if you will, heralded the start of this era, which, has been going on for over a decade now, but of increasing authoritarianism and increasing crackdowns by the Erdogan regime. So that, came out of Gezi Park, and then more so, as we'll probably talk about later on, in response to the collapse of peace talks with the militant wing of the Kurdish movement in 2015, severe civil unrest amounting to a small civil war in southern Turkey in 2015-2016, and then the failed coup attempt in 2016. And Gezi kind of heralded the beginning of this era. It, I think, kind of showed to Erdogan where he stood. We saw there, sort of the strengthening of this anti-Western rhetoric, which had been deploying for a long time, a more clear authoritarianism and opposition to what he would describe as liberal values, Western values, LGBT, minority rights, all these other words which are anathema to a lot of people in Turkey, as elsewhere. And he kind of heralded this era of increasing authoritarianism and repression of different forms of opposition in Turkey.
Because there's at least in Germany, for example, there's kind of this general consensus that the leftist groups, for the most part, have this general assumption that at least here that the Kurdish movements, not just assumption, I mean the Kurdish movements fit very well within the German anarchist, communist, whatever sort of movements that there is a level of solidarity then with that, of course, to whether it be the various, militias that then I think people are aware of, like the YPG, YPJ. There's also then just a general sense of Defend Rojava. You'll see that stuff everywhere. But how then, you mentioned that then there's just Gezi, kind of this, like the left just kind of has this moment that everyone sees of this mix of everything. How well then do they mix together in Turkey? Or like, what is the reaction then of, with the Kurdish movements, as you mentioned before, there has been a very long history in Turkey of the government or, government adjacent people, or just, a general resentment to these groups, whether it be politically, racially, and such like that. How did then these Kurdish leftist groups kind of meld within that of the greater left in Turkey? Or how does them coming to the forefront within all these activist groups to Europe, what does then their reality look like actually then on the ground compared to how we see it? At least I know that we put a lot of focus in Germany within the German left on Kurdistan. But what is their visibility then, at least in this period of time? How is it transitioning, especially with, you mentioned, a civil war that then happens and such, that Turkey... the complexities of that we're not even going to get into, but just simply in the sense that then the Turkish government still today is fighting against groups in northern Syria that then are still connected in some regard, more or less.
Yeah, so I think the sort of Gezi and the period around Gezi. So again, we're talking about like 2013. That was Gezi, and then that kind of couple of years after they did. For some people in Turkey, certainly for, I think a lot of kind of liberal, maybe left-leaning people who live in the, as they would say, more Europeanized, perhaps cities in the west of Turkey, it did bring up the kind of the Kurdish movement and their possible role in pushing for a more progressive solution for Turkey. And, the Kurdish movement did win friends and supporters then. And perhaps, again, also for those people who were able to see through the kind of government's propaganda and position on what's happening at that time in northern Syria. So the Turkish government, on the one hand, offering tacit support to ISIS and enabling them to attack the Syrian Kurds. And on the other hand, as people will probably be aware, particularly in Germany, the resistance against ISIS that was led by the Syrian Kurdish forces, which you mentioned. So this moment did, kind of push, for some people, the Kurdish question, the idea that the Kurds have a sort of progressive role to play became more present. This was also happening at a time, as I say, when there was a ceasefire between the militant wing of the Kurdish movement, so the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, and the Turkish government. So there was perhaps more of a sense that, okay, we can work together. And subsequently in elections, the legal wing at that time, legal wing of the Kurdish movement, as it were, the legal pro-Kurdish party, the People's Democratic Party, or HDP, made gains in the parliament. So there was something there, but as we were saying, more than that, I think how the post-Gezi period has to be characterised is in terms of the crackdown and in terms of a violent response, and that, I think, polarised also most ordinary Turkish people, ordinary Turkish voters against Kurds because, whatever they thought about what's happening in northern Syria, they might have believed the government's line on that, and more so as fighting broke out between sort of Kurdish youth militias, poorly armed, if armed at all, and the Turkish armed forces in southern Turkey, that pushed further opposition to the Kurdish cause. And Erdogan, in those 10 years, has very much made political hay from the sense that the Kurds are the enemy within, that Turkey is being disabled by terror, and so on and so on. And I think, as we saw in the recent election results, then there was a kind of hope and a sense among the Kurdish people that they have more visibility and more of a role to play, and people are willing to enter into some kind of dialogue with them in theory, but in practice, when it comes to the hard negotiations with other political forces in Turkey, or when it comes to voters to turning out and supporting a party which has even been seen to be speaking with the Kurds in any way, then there's still a long way to go.
Oh, I mean, the most vivid image that I can think of is when who was Turkey's? It was either the interior minister or the foreign minister was meeting with members of I think it was representatives from the HDP, and just yelling at them, pointing at them, being like, "You're terrorists, you're terrorists, you're terrorists, you're terrorists." I mean, there is that, obviously. I think that we see the just open, the attitude of the government is exactly that. That then for a lot of people that. It is just clear, the PKK is, all of this Kurdish left. But how then, I mean, aside, how then, as you mentioned crackdowns, and you mentioned the sense of the government, acting upon them, how have the tactics changed over time? You've mentioned previously about how Gezi is the period where then we see Turkey transform more into what people would call an authoritarian state or whatever. But what do then we see then as tactics that the Erdogan government starts using, particularly targeting Kurdish groups, but then also leftist groups, and kind of lumping them into this? Because we've now seen during the election, it was funny to see Erdogan. I mean, not funny, but it's a little bit ridiculous seeing Erdogan calling all of his support, anyone who wasn't against him, oh, they're gay, they're this, they're that, which seems like childish insults. However, Erdogan's been notorious for calling his political opponents, whether it be a Gülenist or whether it be a terrorist or whether it be this, or whether it be that. He's not shy of insults. However, insults are one thing. What have then the actual political repressions, and how have they developed over time against these groups appeared, and what have they looked like?
So I think it's kind of a couple of things to say. So firstly, what I would say is I think it's always worth remembering about this period that we're talking about now. That what it shows is that it's not just a sort of a foregone assumption that the Kurds will always be forever polarised with the Turkish government. It can feel like that. It certainly felt like that in the days after this election. But what this period does show us is that there has been room for peace talks, and it's possible it can happen again. And there's room also for some, at least, people in Turkey to hear that message and to cut through the propaganda. So that should kind of be remembered. But as you say, particularly following this period, it's become much harder than it ever was for any progressive voice to have a hearing in Turkey. You've seen even in the most recent election, the sort of liberal Kemalist main opposition candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, got about 6,000% more coverage on state television than he did. So even for this pretty milquetoast, very limited alternative vision for Turkey, it's pretty hard to get your voice heard, and all the more so for the Kurds. And I think, kind of the main factor that I think wants to be spoken about here is that the issue with the terror label is kind of not just, as it kind of sometimes is, that they're good progressive movements and bad progressive movements in Turkey. That, you know, there's the PKK on the one hand, and they're fighting a guerrilla war, and that's bad. But there are reasonable parliamentary progressive forces pushing for these things as well. But the fact of what Turkey's doing on the one end of completely refusing any peace talks, any dialogue, any engagement with the PKK, and then saying that any particularly Kurdish activism, but as you mentioned, sort of anything in any civil society sphere, speaking about women's rights, speaking about gay rights, speaking about other minorities' rights, all that's all basically PKK terrorism as well. As you see in this kind of farcical thing, which again likes to do of saying, for example, we're intervening in Syria to attack the PKK ISIS terrorists, as though these two groups, it's not the former group which completely obliterated the latter group. You know, it's completely insane. And what that then does is it completely shuts down any possibility to engage with Turkey on, you know, more, even, you know, on the more kind of NGO side of things. You know, it makes it difficult to operate as a lawyer, it makes it difficult to have a women's rights NGO, it makes it difficult to speak about freedom of the press. For example, last year, then Turkey arrested the head of the state medical organization for mentioning some issues around the Kurdish conflict. And, you know, she was like, you know, I don't particularly care, as it were. She was almost saying, I'm not a political person, I'm a doctor, but even the very limited engagement that she was making was, that's it, you know, you're a terrorist, you're going to be arrested. So when that happens, well, it has a couple of implications, but of course, one is that it leaves people who are angry with the Turkish state with no choice but to pursue a more militant angle. So, you know, Turkey is kind of hampering itself in a sense with this rhetoric. But this is the path and the tactics that the Erdogan government has followed. And yeah, I mean, you asked about what are the tactics looking at now, and I suppose, yeah, right now, the other thing to mention, along with, you know, those kind of increasing hollowing out the civil society sphere, the catastrophic drop of Turkey through the World Press Freedom rankings. They're now in the bottom 20. Turkey has, I think, more people jailed on political charges than possibly any other country in the world, among the world's highest jailed of journalists, and so on and so on. And along with that, attacks on the parliamentary Kurdish-led progressive opposition, who get the worst of it. But then, yeah, also, you know, you mentioned other leftist groups certainly will suffer the same treatment. But even, as we say, you know, more liberal groups, reformers, are affected by the Kurdish issue and by Turkey's treatment of these groups.
How did, just out of curiosity, then, because you touched briefly then onto the onto like the whether it be, so I don't remember if it was the question of this one or the previous one about the opposition and their point and their kind of milquetoast take on all this, but Erdogan also too, if I'm not mistaken, was lobbying those type of insults and such as that CHP, a party who historically is quite mixed within their, you know, not obviously not support of the Kurdish left, obviously far more complex, but of, you know, even certain more conservative wings that have a much more, you know, that I can just think of offhand how the CHP's position on things like the Armenian genocide is, you know, not much different, if I'm not mistaken, than that of Erdogan's. That there are some very conservative wings within this. Kılıçdaroğlu also, as well, is not particularly a left-wing figure, if I'm not mistaken, as well in the country. How did then, like, Erdogan still, if I'm not mistaken, lobbed these insults, though, continuously at moderates as well, of being like, oh, you're teamed up with these you know, terrorists and such. Did that end up like being like, does that tactic actually work? I guess I know that sounds very silly in the sense that we can see the reality of these political prisoners that then even as silly as it has become, that then financial reporters being arrested for just reporting on the, you know, economic situation and being arrested for, oh, you're doing currency manipulation, this and that, you know. Do the insults actually, or like, does the rhetoric actually get somewhere with the general public? Do people actually, are they swayed by it? Does it actually hurt the left, or is it much more so that then the rhetoric doesn't actually matter? The actions of the state are far more, you know, overreaching, or the things that then actually, you know, like, if you kind of see what I'm asking in the sense of that then.
Yeah, well, I think yes, certainly the rhetoric is effective, and perhaps sort of the crucial issue here is that yes, it does have an impact on average Turkish voters, some of them anyway, as we saw in the elections. But more than that, it also has an impact on the approach of the main opposition party, the CHP or CHP itself, for example. And it's kind of effective in that way. Not only as a pure electoral strategy, but in terms of forcing this main opposition party into positions which are not all that different, or on some issues possibly more authoritarian and aggressive than those of the Erdogan regime. So yeah, as we kind of saw in the run up to this election, as your listeners might be aware, then this opposition candidate Kılıçdaroğlu made some kind of gestures towards minority inclusion, accused Erdogan of weaponizing the Kurdish issue, but it was all kind of quite thin, quite late in the day, and that was also a ploy in its own right, and comes on the back of his party has backed Turkey's military actions against the Kurds in Rojava, and northern Syria has backed their repression of the Kurdish-led parliamentary opposition, or remained silent on crucial issues, leading Kurdish figures being jailed and so on, and so it was always quite thin. Even then, you had the hard right, really hard right, further to the right of Erdogan, parties in coalition with that main opposition party saying, we're absolutely not going to allow any representation from the Kurdish parliamentary party at all, even if we get into government, and actually trying to leave the coalition in response to them even being in talks. And then immediately following to the result on Sunday, where, as people may be aware, Erdogan didn't completely win, but got into a commanding position for the runoff election, which will happen on Sunday, 28th May, that Kılıçdaroğlu, this opposition candidate, has kind of immediately and drastically pivoted to the right in his rhetoric. But that's always been, underlying their approach and in their kind of roadmap, what they were offering to the Turkish voters about, we're going to restore parliamentary democracy, we're going to restore rule of law. That would have been true to some extent, but they were careful not to mention at all the word Kurd or the Kurdish issue. So, yes, clearly it is effective. And I think that is partially maybe one reason why the results in the initial round of the elections were less positive in terms of the opposition potentially unseating Erdogan than most people had predicted, myself included, insofar as that there are people who perhaps wouldn't admit to being against Kılıçdaroğlu, perhaps on that issue, or perhaps on the fact of him admitting he was a part of the Alevi minority, but were unwilling to vote for him for that reason. So yes, it certainly does effective in the sense of having an effect.
Just for the listener, this episode is coming out actually after the second round of the elections. But so if it sounds like we're talking in the past, we are. This is in between both elections. But nonetheless, I don't think the situation really differs much depending on where we're going to be in the week after the election anyway. But just so the listener knows that we're recording this in the weird in-between period. So another like kind of period that I wanted to also address as well, that obviously got a lot of international coverage too, was the coup against the Erdogan government. And how does this also then shape the formation? I mean, we obviously then see Erdogan go on his tirade against the Gülenists, aka his former best friend, or whatever that whole drama was. But obviously then we see Erdogan's emergency powers, and we see this change drastically. And how does then the left? I mean, because we're talking about then how the government has reacted. Obviously, the government accepts these emergency powers. How does the left then reorganize itself on the ground then, or the Kurdish left start reorganizing itself? Because after there is a clear defining point that Erdogan gives himself these emergency powers, and we see then kind of the behavior of the state of Turkey changed quite drastically. I mean, Erdogan was always kind of, a conservative right-wing figure, had very, pretty standard run-of-the-mill conservative quasi-authoritarian tendencies. But as you mentioned before, journalists, this and that and that, we see, arrests and pressure being put on. So how does the react? Like, how do activists and the Kurdish left groups and such like that on the ground start? How do they have to like reposition themselves within this new sphere of power that drastically changes kind of before their eyes after an apparent attempted coup from the military? That, I mean, I have still vivid memories of that, that news coverage of.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, so as you say, this coup, kind of without going into whatever, who exactly was behind it or what the hell happened there, which is a discussion for another time. But, there was some attempt to challenge the Erdogan governance. And, as you say, this was not a moment, even less so than Gezi Park. This wasn't, a kind of moment where the sort of coach-led opposition was ever thinking of, launching some kind of taking advantage of this breach in the Turkish political consensus, this kind of night of madness to respond and try and organise something themselves. And the fallout from that was much more defined by this crackdown on the on the civil society sphere, which we've spoken about already. I think kind of how this then affected the Kurdish opposition was to do with it contributing to Turkey's sort of international realignment and then increasing kind of antagonism towards America from Erdogan on some subjects, not on others, and increasing kind of isolationism, increasing sort of paranoia, and an increasing sort of sense of, Turkey must go its own way and he himself must, defend his own interests and so on. And, that had different ramifications. But yeah, I think, kind of resulted in this, increasing realignment of, Turkish society and Turkish geostrategy, which has benefited, I think, to some extent, the Kurdish-led opposition, insofar as Turkey's polarization with the West on some issues has allowed them room to kind of negotiate between the two and to sort of survive, as it were, in the cracks of this power bloc, much as Turkey has in its own way between West and East. Sort of overall then, as you said, the years since then have been marked by increasing attacks not only on the Kurdish movement at home, but also across the borders, and not only either in Rojava, which is spoken about already, but something which is also forgotten often is the increasing attacks, quite devastating attacks happening against northern Iraq. So we had this peace process we've spoken about collapsed around the time of the coup, let's say, and as part of that, the militant wing had withdrawn into northern Iraq and had been hoping to negotiate and achieve various concessions on that basis. But then instead what we saw following this new kind of era heralded by the coup was increasing militarization and, attacks outside the Turkish borders to not only target the Kurds in Syria, but also in northern Iraq.
And this is the PKK that you're talking about, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, yeah. Mentioning too also then the international, like how Turkey has also expanded its influence then outside of its borders. One of the most interesting things I think that has come up recently, where Turkey has been a major, I don't know if it's actually that they've been a major like game changer or playmaker or whatever sports term you want to use, because we love using sports terms to describe politics, has been the recent like NATO accessions of Sweden and Finland, where with Sweden, the Turkish government specifically had a bone to pick about the large Kurdish population that then is in that country, and pretty much, if I'm not mistaken, demanded lists of people to be extradited in order for them to join NATO, along with other negotiations in terms of that. Then they had an arms embargo to Turkey as well, and other prerequisites that then that Sweden like kind of gave up immediately in order to join NATO. But how like what are then like other like how has Turkey been, or the Erdogan government, I guess, also been then using this influence internationally in order to then garner support for then this big fight against terrorism, or whatever they call it? Because that's, I mean, I would say the most notable one in the most recent past, because, you know, NATO accession's been a big deal the last year with the Russia-Ukraine war. But also here in Germany too. I mean, there's been, like, the Turkish government has actually used their influence quite a lot to target people within these groups outside of the country.
Yeah. So I mean, I think again, there's a couple of issues here, but the NATO question that you raised, there's kind of two levels, two levels of issue. You know, one is the extent to which Turkey is quite brazenly able to, there's kind of three levels, I suppose. Firstly, there's the question for, even if you're coming at this issue from a purely kind of, yes, NATO is the best thing ever to happen and a big unity of Western peace and love. Even from that perspective, Turkey is clearly acting in a very chaotic, very disruptive way. As Erdogan is trying to, cut deals with Putin on the one hand, and then going back to Washington and seeking concessions on the other. So even purely from that perspective, there are issues with the way that Turkey's acting, and I think some people in the West recognise that, but felt unable to do anything about that. I mean, other state leaders in the West recognise that, but felt they had to bow to Turkey's demands. Secondly, then of course, as you said, Turkey has been able to demand these kind of absurd concessions. So, as you said, giving lists of people to extradite. Some of, for example, famously the Swedish Kurdish MP, who's not from Turkey, she's not a Turkish citizen, they wanted her to be demanded, and Turkey felt they were within their rights to demand her extradition to Turkey. And the various laundry lists of demands, so stopping sort of very limited humanitarian support these countries give to Rojava, stopping allowing them to even have meetings and discussions there, again, which goes back to what we were speaking about earlier, this aim to kind of criminalise any engagement whatsoever, humanitarian, diplomatic, and so on, with the Kurdish movement, and seeking perhaps a green light for further crackdowns on the Kurds at home and attacks abroad. So then there is also this, there's a kind of, sort of a humanitarian question of, what is the cost of, what can Turkey demand? Can it get away with doing what it wants simply because it's in NATO? And then finally, I think, there is also the sort of broader perspective, which again is one that the Kurdish movement would put forward, that this system of, sort of state-backed power blocks built on the strength of states and built particularly at the thin end of the wedge on the strength of authoritarian states demonstrates the failings of this whole system and its inability, as we have seen now, to prevent war. And that's what representatives of the Kurdish movement would say. And that, it's not just, we have to give Turkey these concessions as it so happens so that we can rely on them to stick with us to fight against Russia, A, because that's not particularly happening in Turkey's position and the whole thing is very ambiguous, but also B, the issue is more profound, and since, from 1945, at least until 1949, until the present day, then Turkey has had to be authoritarian and has needed to play this role as the kind of sharp end, the strong end of NATO response to the East, and so needs to be authoritarian, and this makes it very difficult to push for a more progressive, decentralized solution in Turkey.
With the mention of then, once again, Rojava, we might as well just talk about then the situation there as well, because we've talked about that Turkey has obviously intensified their military campaigns, whether it be in the east of its own country, in Iraq, in Syria. What is then still, because Rojava got, of course, a lot of attention, especially in the battle against ISIS and stuff like that. It was definitely one of the most vivid and hopeful, I think, images that the left has had in a while internationally of an actual living project. The realities of it on the ground were always ever changing, of course, because of this, the situation on the ground. But how has then Rojava, because we've mentioned it in a name so many times, how has it then also transitioned to under this increasing pressure from the Turkish government, like militarily, and also Turkey is a NATO member, and there is a lot of complexities here as well that you mentioned too, that there is aid coming from other countries as well, whether it be humanitarian, whether it be some military help, this and that. We're now here sitting in 2023. It is not the same scenario as, say, 2017, I think, was when it was like at its whatever, however many years ago. I'm very bad with dates, but how has Rojava then continuously then been changing under this pressure?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, maybe I would just begin by kind of sounding more hopeful note before I speak about Turkey's strategy against the region today. I was there 3.5 years ago now when Turkey launched its last ground invasion. People will probably remember when Donald Trump said he was going to pull the troops out, and there was, a sort of full-scale military operation. And at that time, there was a lot of prognoses from, Western analysts, Western observers, journalists ran out of the region and were publishing these weekly op-eds about, the end of the revolution and Assad's going to take over and it's all over and so on. And that actually didn't happen. So this invasion was sort of halted through, various diplomatic endeavours, involving the Kurdish-led administration there. And I think a kind of projected collapse or projected despair didn't materialise. The sort of internal tensions as well between the regions liberated from ISIS and the Kurdish majority regions that many people said, this system can't possibly hold together. Their values are too different. 5 years on now from the war against ISIS has held together. It is kind of working better than anywhere else in Syria, with its challenges and with its difficulties as well. And the sort of direct conflict now is frozen, and although that creates a lot of hardships, which I'll mention in a moment, it has enabled continued efforts to keep building and putting into practice forms of this progressive vision which the Kurdish movement offers for decentralization and so on, working together now with what's a majority Arab population. And that, I think, is very positive. And, the region, it's kind of a little bit less fashionable now, but it survives, it endures, and they're trying their hardest. But as you mentioned, Turkey's been putting the region under increasing pressure, particularly, I suppose, since the war against ISIS and since Erdogan began looking more across the Syrian border to bolster his popularity at home. This, of course, has led, as people will probably be aware, to invasion, ethnic cleansing of many of the Kurds, also Yazidis and Christians. But what has been more characterised by a kind of political cleansing, and some Kurds are able to survive in zones of Turkish occupation, mostly old people or those who work for or paid by Turkey. But anyone who is at all associated with these progressive ideas would seem to have worked with the administration, who seem to be in a civil or military capacity, is targeted. So this is one side of things. And then Turkey is keeping up pressure on the still remaining Rojava, the autonomous administration, as it's known, of north and east Syria. So one aspect of that is through continued invasion threats. And, from May 2022, last year, up until now, we saw Turkey. We spoke a bbit about how Turkey is able to manipulate its position as this NATO power but it's a kind of ambiguous one to go between Moscow and Washington, and it's been doing that for the past up until the earthquake, so the best part of the year, and seeking permission from one or the other, because it needs permission from one of these power blocks to launch a military operation. It hasn't been able to get that, again, for various reasons, but it has been able to keep up extreme pressure, the most obvious manifestation of which is a campaign of drone strikes that have been going on throughout the past year in particular, so targeting military leaders in the fight against ISIS, targeting civil society leaders, even, a poet, actors, and infrastructure as well, targeting, gas, oil structure, but also basic humanitarian infrastructure, power stations, water infrastructure. That is a war on anything but name, and is making it extremely difficult to live there, also increasing the economic pressure on the region, throttling the water flow into the region, all of which is compounded by the region's isolation from the outside world. It doesn't have any direct access at all currently to the outside world. The only border gate into Iraqi Kurdistan is currently closed, partially due to Turkish pressure. There's no official UN aid crossing into the region, thanks to the Russians in this instance. So the region, remains kind of highly isolated, and Turkey's strategy is to, in various political, diplomatic, humanitarian ways, verging on the military, to promote internal tensions and dissent, and to prohibit any kind of positive and constructive efforts to build a more progressive alternative for Syria.
How then, kind of coming back into the sense of how this military, I always want to call it a special military operation, but that's what Putin calls his thing. Erdogan's special military operation. Then, what is then the reaction then amongst then other, because kind of going back and forth then here of like the Kurdish left and and then the relationship within the left in Turkey. What is then that like? So during this intensified period that again you mentioned that is still happening, I think that it's very unfortunate that there's very little international coverage of this ongoing, pretty much a war, and not in every other name but that. How have other groups within Turkey then have they tried to rally in support? Has there been some level of solidarity? Has it been difficult? Has the government kind of won on their stamping out the whole terrorism thing, or is there still like a decent amount of solidarity? Was there ever a decent amount of solidarity? Because I feel that then, maybe this is just because I'm in Germany and this and that, but I feel that then that a lot of the solidarity that then I always continuously saw, obviously from Rojava, came from when it was at its most popular, obviously, and now that then it's like kind of where it is currently. Where do we see then this, what is the transformation of a support, if any, from the greater Turkish left into then this project that's still ongoing?
Yeah. So, I think kind of two points on this. So you think the sort of apogee and the high point of solidarity in Turkey with the Kurdish cause, as you've suggested, came during the time of the war against ISIS, and particularly when this war was happening on the Turkish border in Kobani and these other Kurdish towns, where people could literally see from their own homes, and they could see the Turkish tanks blocking the border to the Kurds. They could see, maybe in some instances, ISIS being allowed to use that border to launch attacks, and they could witness what was happening. Nonetheless, there was never a time when the kind of average Turkish voter, I think, would have felt particular sensations of solidarity for or support for the Kurdish-led projects in northern Syria. But that was the time when, almost just a time when it was possible to openly discuss and demonstrate about these things in majority Kurdish regions, even of Turkey. But that time, again, was followed by protests in support of the Kurds in northern Syria. And as a result of that, there were mass arrests. And so that is actually going on until today. It's the Kobani trial of Kurdish, pro-Kurdish political figures in Turkey. So Turkey's seeking about 10,000 years in jail time now for people for participating in protests in support of the war against ISIS, which is one of those things that you read it and you think you misread it the first time, because surely it must be the other way around. But no, that's the situation. So even for, and what I want to say by that is, even for the Kurds themselves, it's extremely difficult to take any other position on this issue now about Turkey's nominal national integrity and so on. And so then that's also bled over. Of course, that also affects other smaller groups on the left. But again, this is, I suppose, it's been a key issue where you see the limitations of the liberal, nominally liberal opposition in Turkey. So on these two military operations against the Kurdish-led autonomous regions of northern Syria, Kılıçdaroğlu has both times given his support and not moved to book back in parliament, and praised the Turkish soldiers for what they're doing. So whether you're on the pro-Kurdish left or elsewhere on the left, or whether it's the liberal opposition, then no, there's not really any room to openly express support for what's happening in northern Syria. That's the reality.
I don't want to speculate too much, but So let's say we hop into the future, and when this episode comes out, let's say that then hypothetically, then theoretically Erdogan were to lose, which I don't want to sound pessimistic now, but it's seeming pretty difficult with the amount of just like election irregularities that are happening and this and that and that. Is there then possibility to move forward then the opposition, the greater, the non-Erdogan opposition, do things actually look, because again, I completely understand in the greater sense that obviously Erdogan is a massively problematic leader. And for a lot of groups, things would drastically change. I think that then that, I think it's fair to say that then for some people in Turkey, things would be a little bit different. This doesn't really look to be the case, though, then for the Kurds, then, does it? If then what I'm hearing then from this. So if we come back when this episode comes in June, comes out in the first week of June, it seems like there's a lot of uphill battles that then still is there at least more room legally that they'll be allowed to exist in, hopefully? Speculation is not the thing that I want to do, but
yeah. Well, I think as you've identified, on the one hand, then there's no point in suggesting that, there is a difference between Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu. A Kılıçdaroğlu government, the Kurdish political representatives have always said, is not going to solve anything overnight, and on some issues is going to be worse. And, they would, look particularly to the potential return of Syrian refugees to Syria, which involve Turkey reaching a deal of kind of normalization potentially with the Assad government. Bad news for Rojava and for the autonomous administration in the north of Syria. So they might cite those kind of issues, the lack of a clear perspective for any real resolution to the Kurdish issue. And finally, we might also look at the problem that were Kılıçdaroğlu to be elected, who would be aligning more directly and simplistically with America, which then might result in, more of these concessions in return for being a good boy and being kind of, NATO's attack dog in the region. All of that being said, it would be a lot better than the alternative which has been offered by Erdogan. And, if Erdogan has been re-elected by the time we hear this, as people expect he will, then yes, it's likely that there's not going to be any kind of less of a pause, less of a kind of lacuna. If Kılıçdaroğlu had wanted to do things differently, I think it would have been, partly to mark a break, to show that he's doing things differently, to show that he's focusing on fixing the internal problems in Turkey, dealing with the fallout from the earthquake. And so if Erdogan is able to overcome that challenge, of course, he's going to show, no, it's more of the same, more so, it's me now. Maybe this will be the last 5 years of his governance, but he's going to want to consolidate power, look for a successor, leave his mark on Turkish politics. So, of course, it's not good news. But, speaking to activists and politicians on the campaign trail in Turkey, then, the Kurdish movement has always had this ability to, they have no illusions whatsoever about the parliamentary process in Turkey, about what it might offer, about their chances of success. They know exactly what they're up against. I think of, this I was reading this week, there's this famous line from Gramsci, which people like to quote, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But as I was reading in the letters, and it's actually what he then says is, I've kind of gone beyond this mere opposition, and I've synthesized these two ideas into something new, and the fact of my pessimism, the fact of my rational pessimism, equips me to know that to see the situation with clear-eyed, and that's what gives me an optimism. And I think one can say something similar about the Kurdish movement. That there's not. I don't think that anyone who was involved in the campaigning, certainly not the HDP politicians who receive jail every day by going out door knocking, by wearing Kurdish colours, do feel or should feel kind of embarrassed or foolish about engaging in this parliamentary process. And they know very well what the risks are. They know very well the limitations of what it can achieve. And this movement has survived and will continue to survive in the breach, and is very capable of coping, using the repression that it's faced, for example, in Rojava, in the Turkish region of Kurdistan, to encourage a new generation to work together against that repression to overcome their differences and so on. So, the road ahead was always long. Maybe it's longer now, but that's, we knew that already.
Yeah, I'm very happy that you turned to resilience and kind of a, maybe not positivity, but a more positive outlook on it, because that was actually what I wanted to ask next is, with everything looking so dire continuously all the time, I don't want to. I mean, we're nearing the end of the episode, and I just had simply two last things I wanted to ask you. This first being then, how do then Kurdish groups on the ground or leftist groups on the ground that are connected with Kurdish movements, how do they build this resilience? Because it is incredibly daunting to have this ever changing government around you that then is locking up people left and right. You said that then sentences that are completely unrealistic for just the most basic of support. How do they then? I mean, obviously, it's simply more than just having a good attitude. How do then how do they find obviously resilience in the sense of maybe just there's the metaphysical aspect of it, but the true actual living politic thing of what is stuff that then kind of through all this that we see get done. I mean, I think it's still incredible. I mean, I weirdly in all this, one of the most motivating things ever has been seeing, institutes like the HDP still try to exist no matter what, that they really do try to form, I believe, I don't know if it is, what's the other part? Gezi,
the Yashul Sol Party, the Green Left Party. Yeah.
Yes. They've kind of taken up then this banner as well to, at least in Germany, of being kind of representative of also to the Kurdish movement. I don't know all the details of this, but still there is still always movements appearing and ever changing things that we always see. And there is always, at least regardless of how dire the situation is, there is a hope that I don't understand, but it motivates me and I appreciate it. How?
Well, I think, I think there is a metaphysical aspect to it. I think that, that's worth thinking about, and that is significant in the political analysis of the Kurdish movement, in some aspects. And it runs all the way through now. So I think on the one end, if you look at the sort of what's their analysis and approach to history, and what it has in common, for example, with a Marxist analysis of history, is the ability to say to people, the fact that you are so alienated and the fact that you are repressed will produce a political response, and we are that response. We manifest that, and that's how they view history in its longest sense, but also the kind of history of the Kurdish struggle and the Kurds kind of as a political class. They are confident in saying, yes, we stand here at a sort of crucial time in history. We stand geopolitically, we're crucial also. And the fact of the attacks on us are themselves proof positive of, in a sense, this growing alienation, which will produce a response. And that kind of follows all the way through to at the other end of the wedge. I don't know, the fact that when someone dies in pursuit of the political goals of the Kurdish movement, they're kind of accepting that, and valorizing of that. And so I think there is this metaphysical aspect to their approach in terms of what they say about how they analyze history, in terms of what they say to the Kurdish people, particularly about their own role, but also what they say about the role of Turkey, and also what they say about the kind of juncture that Turkish society is coming to as being pivotal for the region, and this region being pivotal for the world, and this era being pivotal. So there is that kind of aspect. But then it's also something very pragmatic, and as you said, and I think that kind of understanding and that sort of historical approach then equips people to continue this. So you mentioned that the HDP, who have for some time been the main legal political party representing pro-Kurdish forces in Turkey, are about to be banned. If they are banned, that'll be the 8th pro-Kurdish party in a row that's been banned, at which point you might think people will be like, well, obviously this isn't working, we're going to give up and get our Kalashnikovs and go to the mountains. But of course, they're willing, they've already begun the process of passing on the mantle to the Green Left Party, the Yashul Sol Party, who will continue until quite possibly they're banned and another party comes on, and so on, which, I think this sense of, the kind of political struggle being so existential, kind of gives people the ability to keep going and to see themselves not looking at this election or that election, but thinking about, pushing toward a transformation of society which is operating as best it can, which often is not that much, on different levels, from the neighbourhood up to the parliament on the one hand, to Rojava across the border on the other hand, to the guerrilla fight which is happening in the mountains on the other. And I think, there's a lot I could say about this. And maybe I think the other thing to say would be that what happened in Rojava, I think, kind of gave a lot of Kurdish people, particularly, but progressive people in Turkey, hope. And, support for that has certainly been popular among people who were not previously engaged with the Kurdish movement. And kind of what I think people forget a little bit about that is it was so kind of unexpected, actually, and for the Kurdish movement as well, that, they thought, if anywhere we are able to put these ideas into practice on a mass scale, maybe in Turkish Kurdistan, possibly in one of the other parts of Kurdistan, but no one was really looking at or thinking about Syrian Kurdistan, the smallest of the 4 occupied regions, the most impoverished, one which is faced with very particular forms of repression. But then, everything kind of changed overnight on the basis, it's true, of many decades of organising. And so, I think this almost metaphysical quality, in a strange, almost kind of paradox way, it equips people to be very pragmatic and, willing to go to the Turkish parliament and willing to deal with that system. On the other hand, I don't know, in Rojava, willing to go to Raqqa and work with, very conservative tribal sheikhs who might have supported ISIS last year and probably would again next year if they got the chance. And it kind of equips people, for all levels, from, grandmothers and villagers up to, sort of senior political representatives, to place themselves in this wider, broader context.
Yeah, and also just, kind of tying into that before we go, was that also, how is then the response from, how has international support then been received? And it is, it has been, international support, not response. International support from then other leftist groups. Obviously, we saw, of course, peak during Rojava, of course. But there's still a lot of, solidarity that then we see through, Germany being a big one with then supporting the Green Left Party as well. I've seen a lot of activism then done there. How has then that been received? How have networks been kind of continued internationally within then that of the kind of greater left and their support of this? I think it's clear to say that then it maybe has died down a little bit after Rojava has been out of the main eye, but still how do these groups then kind of, see then their influence is the wrong, I guess, a bit of influence, but then, how is that relationship between other leftist groups and say then, has it been strengthened? Has actually then the government worked, and has the repression been working? Are we just kind of in kind of an unknown period currently until the elections are over? How is
that? I think this international solidarity is, it's very important for the Kurdish movement, which is very open, very outward-looking, very internationally minded, or can be anyway, not always, of course, but strives to be, let's say, a sort of outward-looking movement. It kind of linked to what we were mentioning about this sort of more existential, broader analysis and approach of the Kurdish movement, that it to see itself as offering something to people on the international left, which is absent from, other organised kind of radical leftist alternatives, absent perhaps from other national liberation struggles, sometimes, not always. And so that, I think, has facilitated this kind of openness. And they put a great value on it. You see that very clearly in Rojava. I remember I would sometimes be translating for people who'd come from the West to meet with officials there. And for me, I was often a bit like, okay, we've got a group of, scratty leftists from Frankfurt, but there's, the senator from Belgium or whatever here. In my opinion, we should probably go and speak to the senator, but actually people were very much willing. You're very willing to do both. You gave a lot of importance to speaking with everybody, and Yeah, and I've seen that also from the representatives from the HDP when they've been working in Europe, and I've heard all similar things about how they operate on the campaign trail in Turkey, where as well they've just been joined by a lot of people who went out, people from the UK, where I'm from, but all over the world, all over Europe, to follow along, watch and monitor the electoral process, but also to kind of learn from their approach as well. And so I think, they put a great value on it. And I think, of course, this comes from being a kind of wholly illegal movement effectively for so long. And there's now this kind of there's always this novel sensation, that for certainly was in the time of the war against ISIS, that the Kurds, people had actually heard of them and they knew what they were about, and they had this kind of day in the sun in the liberal press where they were kind of presented in a certain way. And, to some people were these kind of Muslim killing basically Western heroes, and some people were these like idealized leftist visionaries, and the truth, I think, is neither of those things. But this kind of brought with it, more kind of institutional engagement and support, and I think they're happy about that, but they also have recognised the limitations of that, and that it only goes so far, and that 10 years on, Rojava remains so impoverished, so attacked, so threatened. The electoral process in Turkey, for example, the official response from Europe was, oh, well, these elections might not be fair, but they were free, and which is, such a clearly a kind of meaningless response, and if this opposition's been jailed 8 times in a row, if, about 4,000 of their party members are currently in jail, in what sense was this a free election? It means nothing. And so because of the limitations that they recognise in the institutional political engagement with the West, then, of course, they value and they stress continued international solidarity and support also.
Well, one last thing I wanted to ask then is, what then are ways that mentioning solidarity, what are then things, I guess, that then we then there's very rarely, I think, instances where we have on the show, I think we can actually do like a call to action thing. But how can, we still in the West support then these movements? I mean, because it is very hard right now, and it can be possibly getting a lot harder depending on when this episode released. So we probably still going to be Erdogan in power. What are then ways that then we kind of, as whether it be European, Western, what leftists anywhere? I mean, maybe there's people who listen to the show in the Philippines. I have no idea. What are then ways that then I guess that people could be in some way showing solidarity? I know that that's a big question to ask, of course, but I feel that then this is one that then probably knows how to then accept support with one way or the other.
Yeah, so I think again this is kind of linked to the fact that the Kurdish movement has these different aspects we've been talking about. There's Rojava, there's this parliamentary party, there's civil society stuff, there's kind of open warfare also with the Turkish government in other regions. So there's a kind of range of important steps that kind of need to be taken that people can take. I'll mention a couple of things. Yeah, firstly, kind of on the more institutional level, it's really important, I think, for political parties and parliaments in Europe to be taking steps to stop this pro-Kurdish HDP party from being banned, and for there to be more kind of rule of law. There are 11 MPs from this party currently in jail, and they have sister parties all over Europe. They're various leftist parliamentary or left-wing parliamentary parties. So governments and parliaments should be speaking up about that. Just purely from the basis of respect for parliamentary democracy. That's very important. There are other important issues if people are looking to kind of raise institutional awareness. Yeah, perhaps the key issue would be around this criminalisation of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is has been a key issue and has been raised more and more in European parliaments, in European courts as well. That actually there's no reason for this movement to be considered a terror organisation whatsoever, because it doesn't commit terror attacks. It's just in a civil war in which it conducts itself according to international norms. It's a signatory to the Geneva Convention, and it's just because Turkey says so they're terrorists. And so this year, what is called the D-list PKK campaign is something that's being raised a lot on the institutional level in Europe as well. This is very important. And then, on the other side of things, of course, I think, as I mentioned a bit at the end, it's the simply important, I think, for the Kurdish movement that, more people know about them, know what they stand for, know that perhaps they are saying something a bit different to just kind of another quote-unquote national liberation struggle or another human rights issue, but that they're trying to do something different, trying to build an alternative, and see whether that's learning more about Rojava, learning more about the approach of the movement. I think they're very keen for people to do that, engage with it, and I think personally it's important for that, both to understand it and to critique it, and there are issues with this movement as well, and I think it's very productive and healthy for them to be in conversation. I don't know yet. I know there was recently kind of first discussion actually with militant leftist groups in the Philippines and the Kurdish movement that happened, I think, last week. And they're very interested to engage with all sorts of, civil society movements, women's movements, indigenous movements, leftist movements, all across the world, most simply perhaps in Europe, but by no means just in Europe. So, I think just, that kind of engagement from the grassroots up to the level of, writing to your MP or senator or asking for a meeting or whatever it might be is very important. And, supporting the Kurdish Red Crescent on a humanitarian basis as well.
Okay, great. Before you leave, Matt, where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on the internet by searching for my name. I will shock you to say. Matt Broomfield, and I publish not just but a lot about the Kurdish issue. I also have a book of poetry, Brave Little Sternums, poems from Rojava, which I wrote during the 3 years that I spent living in Rojava, and also give some background about the revolution, which you can, again, find by Googling it or me.
Great. Matt Broomfield, thank you so much once again for coming on. And
my pleasure.
For our listeners, nothing to announce except for keep your eyes peeled for a Hamburg show that we're in the process of planning. And we will see you all next week for the regular episode. Take care.